So hi, I'm Laura. I'm a designer front-end developer with 10 Pound Gorilla, and today we're looking at how you can customize the styles in Tailwind to match what you need to code. So instead of writing a lot of CSS, most of what you're doing when you're customizing the Tailwind theme is in the config file, Tailwind config, which lives at the root of your project. All of the different sections in the configuration file are optional. So if you leave one out, it will fall back to the default configuration, which is quite long. It's kind of similar to like when you're working with Bootstrap, it's that giant variables file. These are just all the different settings that you can work with out of the box. I didn't spend a lot of time looking at it, I won't lie. So there are two main ways that you would customize it. One is by extending the default theme, which is just adding on your own custom classes. This preserves all the default values, so you can still rely on some of like the other colors that are defined out of the box or different spacing classes. And here, the example that they provided, like border radius, spacing, just modifying those, adding some new values. Then you can also override the default theme. And this is done directly in the theme section of the config file. And this completely replaces the default configuration for that key. So you'll see like in here, they defined some different colors, and that makes it so those are the only ones available. You're not also able to like grab I don't know what's not in there, red or indigo or something that is defined in Tailwind's defaults. So what Chris kind of challenged me with was to recreate one of the style guides that I put together for a Bootstrap project, just kind of showing all the colors and the heading sizes, different paragraphs, a couple buttons, and try to recreate that using Tailwind. And it was a challenge. So these are a few things that I learned along the way. First being that you can get pretty far with the default styles. They're a really good starting point. These colors and font sizes, the font itself, they're not exactly what's in the style guide for this particular project, but I was able to recreate it pretty close. So that is nice for like some rapid prototyping or just kind of demonstrating something to the client. You can get pretty far without having to customize anything. The first thing I learned though, right out of the box, Tailwind adds its pre-flight styles when it's compiled. It's really kind of an opinionated reset. It removes all of the margins, the headings are unstyled, lists are unstyled. So you really get like this plain text document that you're kind of looking at it going, oh geez, I have to rewrite everything because there aren't any of the browser defaults to rely on. Another thing I learned is that the container class, I figured it would be a lot like Bootstrap, but it's not exactly the same. And their documentation even says, note that unlike containers you may have used in other frameworks, Tailwind's container does not center itself automatically and does not have any built-in horizontal padding. So it's just up in the top left corner. There's no padding on the sides. And also it's not a different width than your browser window. So whereas in like Bootstrap, you have the different breakpoints and then the container's smaller, contained in the center there. What Tailwind does is the container's max width is equal to the minimum width of the breakpoint. So the example here, like kind of the tablet breakpoint, the minimum width is 768, and that is exactly what your container is. So my screen size here wasn't much bigger than that. and I barely had any extra room over on the right. But really quickly, because that bothered me, I figured out you can modify it pretty quickly in the Tailwind config just by changing a couple values. Change the center value to true, and you can add padding, any value you want. You can also do it on a per breakpoint basis, but just because I needed some breathing room on the sides while I was working, started out with these. Another challenge for this particular project was that the designer changed the line height for all the different like paragraph sizes. So there was a small paragraph, a large paragraph. All the headings had different line heights. I'm like, this is stupid. Like, why are we doing this for one? But then also, how can I write this a little quicker? And what I found out was that Tailwind, when it sets the default text sizes, all those different text dash, base, large, whatever utilities, they also set a default line height to go with it. And you can do that too when you are extending or redeclaring the font sizes. And it's just square brackets. The first value is the font size, second is the line height. If you leave it off, like I did for the extra small font size in the example, it just falls back to the default. You can also do it on the fly. That's kind of what I wanted to avoid, was doing like text base, letting, which is their class for line height value. There's a shorthand notation. You can do like text base /6, which is short for letting 6. It's a little shorter, but it still requires a little bit of extra work. But this font size and line height combined declaration was a nice way to accomplish what the designer was doing with all those different styles. Adding all the different colors, I learned you can define multiple variants of a color pretty easily with the nested notation. So this particular project had a lot of different blues. One was the primary brand blue. Then there was one for like the hover and active states of buttons. There was a darker blue, a medium blue, a light blue. So I defined that all in one little nested chunk here, and the nested keys get combined with the parent key to form the full class names. So like for background color, you would have BG-blue-medium. And you can use the handy little shortcut of the default key if you want to define a value with no suffix. So BG blue for their primary brand blue without any of the modifiers on the end. Just gave you a little bit of shorthand notation. You can see how that worked out in the example here. So their brand blue doesn't have a suffix like light, medium, dark, whereas some of the others do. So just a little bit shorter and kind of a fallback. So I kept forgetting to put like blue-500 out of the default Tailwind theme to make the color variables actually work. So I was getting no colors at first, but there we go, color setup. You can also in Tailwind define custom classes to avoid repeating yourself, keeping your code a little drier. And you would do that instead of writing out normal property and value declarations, you use their @apply directive. So it's kind of like just taking what you would have in the class tag and putting it into a CSS rule set using @apply. Oops, and I hit my mouse there. So I did this for the buttons, and example on the bottom shows that it did come out exactly the same, but I knew that going throughout this project, I wouldn't want to repeat all of those classes. I used to create the button every time we needed a button. So I created a custom class in the main Tailwind CSS file. And you always need to put it in an appropriate layer. I'm not super familiar with CSS layers, but Tailwind breaks up their default stuff into the base layer, components, and utilities. So just tried to guess like which one this felt most like, and it seemed more like a base layer to me, since buttons are pretty essential to what you need on a web page. So this gave just a little bit of shorthand, similar to, I keep hitting the mouse, Bootstrap button primary, but in this case, blue classes. And after more hours than I was allocated for this research, I did come out with something that is pretty close. It's not exactly the same as with the Bootstrap theme. I think the main differences are just like I was relying on some of Bootstrap's fallbacks that are more opinionated resets for things, whereas Tailwind does it a little bit different. But overall, it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. I do have a link in here, and I'll put this in the chat too, so you guys can check out exactly what I did. This is with Tailwind's Play environment, kind of like their own JS Fiddle or CodePen. It lets you compile all of it just on the fly. You can change the config and see it in real time without having to like install Node or do anything in terminal. It's just a nice little test environment. And yeah, my first foray into Tailwind. What questions do you guys have at this point?
Did you happen to look into the Tailwind typography plugin at all?
I didn't.
Because I think that might solve some of the problems that you were having.
Yeah, it gives you like an extra class. I did read a little bit of the documentation. Like you can add a class to your containing div, like pros, I think is what it is. And it does give you back some of those default kind of styles that I found that shit, it was just totally all plain text. But I didn't look into how to customize that more and make it work with making this brand style guide. But I think it's definitely a good option for just more out of the box styling. That could be a topic for someone else to do later on, is how to work with that and make those styles work and shorten up our development time.
I had a question about that config that you were displaying. It was a couple screens ago, probably early on. You define, is it correct that you define your modifications, and then if you modify the style, that specific property set of properties are being updated, but everything else that's default with Tailwind still ships?
Yeah. In the config file, there's a theme key. Within it, there's an extend. Extending is just adding on to it. So like I could still go in here and use their default green text color or background color. It's still available to me. Whereas if you defined like colors outside of that extend, it would totally override and break. But it would override all of the colors that are normally defined. So then you can't use them. It's only allowing you to use the new ones that you're putting in. So two different spots, but.
So it looks like it would work a lot like a JavaScript object kind of.
Yes.
Where like putting it directly in is basically referencing the exact property and overriding it, whereas using the extend property just adds whatever.
Exactly.
Cool.
And this extend, it just really makes it available at that point in time. Do you still run the purge or clean? So maybe you did define, a button indigo, but you never used it anywhere, so it would still strip out that classes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, like if I put in test color and gave it a value of, I don't even know, something, probably not a valid Xcode, but I never use it. It never gets put. You can look at the generated CSS, but it'll never get put in here.
Gotcha.
Granted, if you wanted it to always be put in there, I imagine you could just link the template like path to the thing that was built right here, the style guide.
Right, and there is another section in the config file that I don't have in here that you can set like kind of some ignore rules like you would with purge CSS. So telling it like never get rid of this, always have it available, even if I haven't used it yet.
That seems especially nice for things like WYSIWYGs.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely want to have like some of the core classes that you know might get used kind of preserved, even if you haven't used them in any of your HTML or JavaScript templates that it's referencing. And that's another thing in this Tailwind apply environment that you don't see, but I did do it all in actual VS Code project, but one of the sections in the config file is defining your content that it's referencing for which classes to compile and which not to. So looking in like your source folder for any HTML or JavaScript files.
Yeah, like in our case, we could probably just route it to the Too Sexy and EasyDNN news folders.
Yeah.
Yeah. Being able to still run the purge, but then specify specific CSS that you want to keep is probably super helpful when we're looking at third-party modules where we can't control the markup, but we also don't have access to the code that it's rendering. So like action form, for example, we can't control the markup that's outputting. So we might need to define specific styles that we don't want it to delete.
I do have, because I wrote them as custom, I guess, not really classes, but some custom CSS for the core H1, 2, 3, 4 styles, because I figured if we're going to be reusing those in a template for anything, why repeat all those classes? And then if you change the style down the road, go back and change all those templates for you have an H2. So if you do define custom things in here, and I did it the correct way according to Tailwind, I didn't write a property and a value, I applied one of their classes. So later, if you did change the size for text 3XL, these custom classes would inherit that, but the custom classes always get output, even if you're not utilizing them.
I would imagine in most Tailwind projects, there's probably at least a little bit of this.
Yeah.
Did it output your text blue as a variable?
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Well, at least text opacity. It does have custom properties or variables built in. I don't really know how to adjust any of those or anything yet, but they are in there. Yeah, if you go down to the bottom of like the compiled stuff, there are a lot of custom variables that get output, but I didn't get that far.
One of the things you mentioned seemed really nice, the ability to set basically sub colors.
Yeah.
Which, unless I'm mistaken, I don't know that there's like a great way to do that in Bootstrap. They're just defining an entirely separate color most of the time.
Yeah, I did it just because this particular brand had a lot of different blues, and then they're used in buttons. So I also defined like the hover and the active colors for the buttons as kind of subcolors or variants of that base blue. That way it's all just, there's the same prefix and I know where to find them. I don't know if it's the best route, but it's the route that worked for me.
It's nice, especially on projects like this that may have been designed by, I'm going to name drop Brianna here. I'm sorry. Just calling her out here. But her designs were very deliberate on the color selections for like the hover and active states, instead of using like a percentage-based calculation, which is what Bootstrap would do for you. And so without that standardization from a design perspective, being able to define them here in Tailwind just gives you all of that control, which this nested structure is really nice because then we don't have like blue light or lightest or all of those other variants. I guess you could have those, which you do have a medium light and whatever, but
Tailwind out of the box uses like blue 100 through 950 for all the different shades of blue, and you could do that here, but these were the ones like a dark, medium, and light were defined in the style guide, so I just kind of went with that and rolled with it. The designer for this project was quite specific on the line heights too. Like the small paragraph has a different line height than the regular, it has a different one than the large, which has a different one than a block quote. Like each one really required its own little thing, which is something we've struggled with in Bootstrap, which I found nice here. Like if you applied the text large class, you could automatically have it apply that specific line height without having to redeclare anything.
Yeah, like one of the things that was mentioned that was made to sound like a negative, which to a certain extent it is a negative in some ways, but the fact that pretty much everything is entirely reset from the beginning seems nice in some ways, because when there's a bunch of stuff like this that needs to be very specific, I feel like you don't have to fight the existing styles quite as much. It's less likely that you're going to get caught with a style that you didn't want being applied to whatever paragraph.
Yeah. It seemed like more of a negative at the time just because I wasn't expecting it. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's no styles to this at all.
Yeah.
The documentation does say there are some more opinionated styles in that pre-flight reset, but I barely scratched the surface of markup, so I don't even know what those would be quite yet. Probably like form fields or different things of that nature, but headings were not among them.
Something I struggle with is we create a boilerplate template code repo to kick off our development for our themes. That it's using Bootstrap, so maybe that's part of the train of thought that we have on it. But when we start to build the site, we have all these things defined, and we just need to make a few modifications to usually some variables to like change out our buttons to fit the client's design. But with this, the question is like, do you start with a brand new slate every time? Do you do something that's very minimal and then start adding everything that you need? But then are we adding more work for ourselves to build them in the first place? It'd be really cool to build a theme with Tailwind just to do like a review of the process and again, doing code comparisons to see what is the output and file size and some of that stuff.
There is another thing, and it's not in here in the config file, but it's like a preset, so you can import, I guess, kind of a shared config file. So if any sites that we build, we know we define certain things or modify certain things, you could pull in that default kind of a starting point. Something I saw in the documentation, but again, didn't really explore.
Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our Gorilla Learning Lab. We have a lot more banana tidbits for you to get ape over. Check out our other videos or visit our website at www.10poundgorilla.com. I'm swinging on out of here.
Ooh, ooh, ah, ah. Ooh, ooh, ooh. You're not subscribed? That's bananas!